Hi, how are you?
Good morning,
Good.
sir.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine, sir. And you?
Good. And we got a seat for you there. That's perfect. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ed Cheredjian. I'm the founding director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning to Rice University's Baker Institute and to this event that we're co-sponsoring with the Hobby Center for the Study of Texas, and my good colleague Steve Murdoch, who's here, will be making introductory remarks after I do. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special event on Perspectives on the Texas Legislature, the 2013 session. We're very happy at the Institute to lend our support to this conference. It couldn't be more timely. Since its inception nearly 20 years ago, we're going to be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Baker Institute next year. We've been advocating and committed to advancing the cause of effective public policy at all levels of government. So this conference embodies that ideal at the state level. Well, look, and bombarded as we are 24 hours a day by what sometimes seems to be minute-by-minute developments in Washington, we sometimes forget the critical role of state policy. Yet decisions made in Austin in such areas as education and taxation touch the lives of millions of Texans in important, sometimes very decisive ways. This is particularly true today as our state leaders come to grips with enormous economic challenges and changes and historic demographic transformations. The Texas Legislature will face a host of challenging issues when it convenes in January. The most prominent is the financing of K through 12 public education in the state, which in turn is linked to debates over proposals for parental choice reform, such as adoption vouchers. Due to two recent federal court decisions which found legislation passed in 2011 to not comply with the Voting Rights Act, the legislature will return to the redistricting table, as well as revisit the state's voter ID legislation, which, as you know, has gotten national attention. There also is certain to be a discussion of the growing share of the state budget consumed by Medicaid expenditures along the pros and cons of expanding Medicaid coverage as encouraged by the Affordable Care Act. Lastly, the legislature will be in a more diffuse manner confront the wide variety of water policy issues, ranging from reservoir construction to the recycling of water used in the fracking process, which is becoming a major issue in the energy sector, a very important one. So we're truly fortunate to have with us an extraordinary group of participants. You read the program and the speakers. They include government representatives, business leaders, members of the media, educators, and scholars. And among the last, I'm proud to say, is the Baker Institute's own Mark Jones, our fellow in political science, who's a Baker Institute fellow and doing great work here. Let me say that what the experts here today don't know about Texas policy and politics probably isn't worth knowing. These are the best. And we can expect an informed and far-ranging discussion of subjects critical to all of us who are proud to call Texas home. So let me turn the chair over to Dr. Steve Murdoch, director of the Hobby Center for the Study of Texas, with whom I mentioned earlier. We're happy to co-host this event. Steve. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here, and I welcome all of you to our conference. We're expecting that we'll get about 70 or 80 more of you, at least as assignees. We're pleased to have you here, and we do have a very exciting program. As the Ambassador said, we've got some of the best people in their areas in the state. The four gentlemen that will be in this first panel, for example, are the people who do budgeting in the technical sense and from a standpoint of keeping all the rest of us in line relative to expenditures, and that actually do a great deal in creating the budget. And we will let them introduce themselves and go forward in just a few minutes. I want to begin by thanking the Ambassador of the Baker Institute for partnering with us on this, and thank especially Whitney Smith and her staff that arrange such conferences. They are consummate professionals in all regards and make it relatively easy for those of us that are on the end of a program planning. And because of the time, because we're a little bit late going, I'm just going to leave the thank yous there. Welcome all of you on behalf of the Hobby Center for the Study of Texas. This is a center that was established with an endowment from former Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby, who, as most of you know, is the longest-serving Lieutenant Governor in the history of Texas, and will be here a little bit later in the day. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Billy Hamilton. Billy is former Deputy Controller of the state of Texas for a mere 19 or 20 years or something like that. And he will then lead us through the panel, which has John Hellman, who is now in the hot seat for doing the budget forecast for the state and for the legislative consideration. Mike Morsi, who is a budget person with the governor's office, and Andrew Blifford, who is the budget person for the Speaker of the House. They will take about an hour or so, and will give us an overview of that, and we will have time. We'll make time at the end for some questions from the audience. So with that, Billy.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I used to have John's job, and there was a guy who worked for the Legislative Budget Board who was the budget director for the state, other than the governor's budget director. And we were serving during the period of the oil bust, and we were asked to speak in a lot of places like this leading up to the session. And we were both fairly new to our jobs and pretty glum about the way things looked, with oil prices falling and the state budget apparently coming apart. And we got to be known in the press as Tweedledum and Tweedlegloom. But the one thing I learned from that experience is, you know, the sun will come out tomorrow, that Annie was right, that there's, you know, that the state has a long history, a strong economy, a vibrant future, no matter how the present may look. And last session looked very, very bleak. It was a difficult session, I think, for the legislature. And whenever that happens, people immediately assume, at least in my current profession, which is kind of consulting with people on the legislature, which also goes by the name of lobbying, they always assume that the next session is going to be worst, but if you look at the long history of things, it almost never is. Partly that's because the economy is resilient and it comes back, and John will be talking, I hope, about the economy. But I always like to think the other reason is because revenue estimators get scared and they push their revenue estimates to the floor. And so it's got to be better than the outlook. And I say that not because of anything John's done, but because of things I've committed in my time, because you want the state to be in a good position. So if I had to tell you one thing about the session next time, it's going to be a lot less difficult than it was in 2011. That said, the other thing I'll tell you about a legislative session, and I've sat through legislative sessions since 1976, is that there is no easy legislative session. In a large, growing, complex state like Texas, there are no simple solutions to large problems. And the state has a lot of difficult issues that it's going to be facing, not the least of which is public education, where the state now faces 6 lawsuits that probably won't be resolved during the regular session. So as we look ahead, it shouldn't be as miserable as in 2011, but the session is not going to be without its changes. And I salute the Baker Institute and Steve and Governor Hobby for looking ahead, because I think it's an important issue. These are going to be important issues for the state of Texas, and it's critical that people think about what the future of the state is and how the legislature will be shaping that when they convene next January for their 140 days, and then look forward to either a very long summer or a very long fall of dealing with school finance issues, which I suspect may happen. So you've heard the panelists. I think the order that we sort of decided is John Helleman. He is the Chief Revenue Estimator for Controller Susan Combs. He's held that position for 8 years. I like to say he was also my revenue estimator. He was revenue estimator when I was Deputy Controller. That is a job that if you can last 4 years, which is how long I lasted, I always thought you were doing a great job, and he's already doubled that. So, you know, for a man of 27, he looks pretty good for a revenue estimator. Then Andrew Bifford will be speaking, taking the legislative perspective. Andrew is the budget director for Joe Strauss, the Speaker of the House, position he's held since 2009, not 19. And before that, he worked 8 years for Chairman Pitts when he was managing the budget for the House. And then finally, Mike Morsi, who's been around Texas forever, even though he graduated from the University of Oklahoma and therefore carries a taint that no time can erase. He is a former director of budget and planning for the governor and is now the senior advisor to Governor Perry. So without further ado, we'll start with John.
Thank you, Billy. I appreciate that. Again, my name is John Helleman, and I work with the Controller's Office. And I'm going to get the really boring stuff out of the way early for everybody. And then the rest of your day and the panelists that follow behind me, I'm sure will be much more interesting, because what I'm going to talk about primarily here this morning is the economy in our state and a little bit about our state revenue collections, and hopefully set the scene for the discussion that's going to come after me. One thing that I usually mention in all of these talks that I give is about the recession that we have gone through several years ago. And it's just, I think, part of human nature that whenever something difficult happens, you want to forget it as soon as you can and move ahead and not think about it too much anymore. But I think it's instructive to at least not forget it for a little while longer and remember just how severe this recession was. Now, we had a severe recession in our state in '86 and '87, and I know especially we're going to have folks here today in Houston that remember that because it was so intricately tied to the oil and gas industry, and Billy was just mentioning it also. Believe it or not, this last recession was actually more severe than that. And I've told people that, and they just looked at me disbelievingly and said there's no way that could be right. But in fact, we actually lost more payroll jobs in our state in this last recession than we did in '86, '87. In fact, about 1 out of every 25 payroll workers in our state lost their job during this last recession, or about 428,000. Now, the good news is that Texas has, as Billy was saying, performed somewhat better than the United States as a whole, more vibrantly. All of those jobs have now been replaced in our state, and more than 100,000 more beyond that have been added back. So since we bottomed out right at the very end of calendar year 9, which is starting to be a little while back now, we've been growing and adding jobs every month since then. And so all those jobs that have been lost have now been replaced, plus over 100,000 more. Well, how's the United States as a whole performed? Well, the answer is not quite as well. We've been recovering at about the same time period as the United States as a whole, but we've just been doing somewhat better. The United States as a whole lost 1 out of about every 16 payroll workers, or about 9 million jobs. Roughly half of those have been replaced. The United States payrolls have been growing every month, just like ours, just not as much. Right now, the unemployment rate in our state, which I think we can all remember in the mid-2000s had gotten quite low, certainly here in Houston, certainly in Austin. Our unemployment rate is back down to about 7.1%. Certainly much improved. We got up to the point where we were touching 9% in our state. The United States unemployment rate is about 1% higher than that, and it also is much improved from the approximately 10%. So the fact that we've recovered somewhat faster than the United States as a whole is reflected in these numbers, and in fact, our unemployment rate is a little bit better than the United States. A question I frequently get is, well, did this hit all the different industries in our state about the same? And the answer is no, it didn't. Some parts of our economy, such as the healthcare sector, really didn't see too much change in employment at all. Other parts of our economy were very hard hit, specifically the construction industry, which makes sense given the kind of recession the housing industry's had, oil and gas, and manufacturing. Each one of those three lost between 15 and 20% of all payroll workers during this recession. The good news here in Texas is that in the manufacturing sector, it's substantially recovered. The oil and gas sector has actually recovered all the jobs that were lost and added a few beyond that. Unfortunately, the housing sector, as we all know, has not yet recovered. And I will talk about this a little bit later, but it looks like it's up off the bottom, and it is recovering, and it is adding jobs, but only slowly, and it hasn't done nearly as well as the other two sectors by way of recovering. What about some other states? We talked about the U.S., we talked about Texas. What about some other states? California, biggest state in our country, more or less from its top to its bottom in terms of employment, lost over 8% of its employment. Florida, over 9%. Michigan, over 9%. Georgia, over 8%. So certainly, like some of these industries I'm describing, all the states didn't perform the same either. Well, let's talk a little bit about housing. You know, through the years, housing has been a very vibrant part of the Texas economy, and it's also somewhat volatile. And certainly I can remember in the early 1980s in Austin that we had a real housing bust. Now, the interesting thing that happened with housing this last recession is that we started selling a lot fewer homes. We started building a lot fewer homes. However, the overall price level did not go down dramatically, such as we saw in Florida, California, Nevada, and some of the other places in our country where prices plunged. This didn't happen in Texas, and we're very fortunate. The number of units transacted, however, did go down. In terms of building new homes, and I think we can all think back of those days in the mid-2000s when there were new subdivision and new home signs at every intersection in your town. We're way below that, and that was an all-time peak. Last year in Texas, we built about 62,000 brand new homes, single-family homes. This year, we're going to build more than that. But that's far below the peak of the mid-2000s. Prices, however, are firm. With regard to existing homes, very similar pattern. The mid-2000s saw us selling homes at an all-time peak. We've come way off of that. However, things are improving, and certainly this year we're going to sell more existing homes than we did last year. And finally, with regard to housing, and a good handy statistic is for existing homes that are being sold, how many months of inventory do you have? And at one point in Texas, it had gotten up to somewhat over 8 months worth of inventory, close to 9 months worth of inventory. And that's a lot for Texas. In Miami, it had gotten up to over perhaps 2 years worth. They just weren't selling any homes there. Las Vegas, similar thing. So even at our worst, Texas is doing much better throughout this situation. And right now we have less than 6 months worth of inventory on hand of existing homes, getting back towards our historical norm. Another major sector of the Texas economy that must be discussed, and again, this is a unique audience here today because this is the city that is the focus of the oil and gas industry in the world. Oil and gas has most certainly played a part in the recovery from this past recession. I think we can all remember in the summer of 2008, we went to the gas station, we were seeing gasoline that had now gone up over $4 a gallon. Certainly that made me wince. And that summer we saw oil, somewhat briefly, but oil did get up to $140 a barrel. Following that, as we moved into recession, it plunged. And that next spring, we were down in the $35 a barrel range. A sharp drop. And sure enough, that same period of time, the drilling activity in Texas dropped by a very large amount. We went from about 900 rigs operating in our state to 300. But oil proved to be very resilient. And the price of oil throughout 2009 came back rather quickly. And by the end of the year, we were up in the $80 range. Unfortunately, natural gas did not follow that same pattern and to this day has not really recovered. It had also gotten to very high levels in 2008. It plunged just like oil did. And yet it doesn't really look like it's coming back. Today, we're at about $3.50 per MCF. With the amount of drilling activity that's going on, with the new shale fields, not only in our state, but in other parts of the country being opened up, and with the usage of natural gas primarily limited to heating things, the price of natural gas probably is going to stay about where it is for some years to come, certainly in the near term. Now, another interesting thing is as we've opened up these shale fields, and I know a lot of you are intimately familiar with this. As we opened up a lot of these shale fields, we found out that not only can we get natural gas that way, we can get oil as well. And oil production, which had been declining for 25 years in our state, slowly but declining, in 2010, 2011, and it'll be again in 2012, we're going to see the production of oil in our state actually on the uptick. The production of natural gas, of course, was also increasing as well, but with the price levels that we're now seeing, it's now leveled off and actually started to decline somewhat. One interesting thing I wanted to point out that I discovered when I was putting together some of these materials is that these price levels obviously move the industry. 5 years ago, we also had about the same exact number of rigs as we have today, roughly 900. 700 of those rigs are drilling for gas, only 200 for oil. Today, with those same 900 rigs, it's exactly reversed. 700 are drilling for oil, mainly in the Permian Basin and south of San Antonio, the Eagle Ford Shale, only 200 for gas. Well, let me transition a little bit now from an overview of the Texas economy, how we've recovered from recession, and some of the strengths and still weaker parts, and talk a little bit about state revenues. Obviously, the sales tax is our state's largest tax. It brings in about 60% of all the money into our general fund. And it's had quite a ride throughout the 2000s until today. In fiscal 6 and fiscal 7, which is also related to that time that was pre-recession when we had all the housing going on that I just discussed, that tax was rising at double-digit rates, 12% and almost 11%. It went into a 2-year decline as we moved through recession. The last 2 years that have been completed, however, we're back to robust growth once again of 9% and over 12%. So the sales tax is greatly influenced by our economy, of course, And it's also greatly influenced by things operating in our economy that are of somewhat more of a volatile nature, like the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry pays sales tax on many of the things they use in the field, such as pipe, drill bits. And in that period of time I mentioned earlier, when things were depressed in that industry, the amount of revenue we were getting was fairly low. However, today, with the amount of activity we have in the field, it's much, much greater, which is tending to not only add to our revenue stream, but when you look at these percent changes, it's going to serve to push them up somewhat higher. So people are back in the stores. The biggest component of our sales tax are retail sales. And we've got people back in all sorts of stores buying, but adding to that are things like these oil and gas purchases, and also restaurant meals, which we do tax under our sales tax as well, which are very strong. Briefly mention a couple of other taxes. Our automobile sales tax, down over 22% as we moved into recession, has substantially come back last year, and most especially in fiscal 12. And the reasoning, I think, is pretty clear, and that is that as people had perhaps lost a job or their spouse had lost a job and their household finances simply weren't as good, they delayed making that car purchase they would have normally made. And the last 2 years, as our economy has substantially recovered, they actually have gone out and now replaced that car that needed replacement, and we're getting some of this pent-up demand being released. Our franchise tax was also hit, as all our other taxes were hit by the recession. We finished fiscal 12 with a much better performance with our franchise tax, bringing in about $4.5 billion. Finally, our severance taxes, and we do have, as you all know, taxes on oil and natural gas that are extracted from the earth. They've followed the same pattern as this industry has cycled down and then cycled back up. We've seen those tax revenues do the same. In fiscal 12, which is our most recently concluded year, only a few months ago, we saw that our oil tax brought in $2.1 billion, and our natural gas tax $1.5. Now, of that, a little bit less than $1.9 billion is going to be moved over to the rainy day fund later this fall. The rainy day fund is available for use, and I'm sure some of our panelists later will probably discuss this. It is available to use by the legislature, of course. Once this transfer is made later this fall, the overall balance in the fund will be approximately $8 billion. And I think, Billy, at that point I'm going to stop and hand it over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It's kind of amazing what 2 years, the difference 2 years makes. I think all those figures John gave you were basically in reverse than where they are right now, and that gives us optimism that I think Billy said this session will be definitely less painful than 2011. We remain optimistic about the economy. I guess the biggest question is, will we keep growing? How long and at what rate? Aside from some of the unknowns that John touched on, some of the things we're concerned about are the Budget Control Act, the fiscal cliff, Congress's action in December or January. Not only could that result in less federal funding for some state agencies, but also expiration of the tax cuts, which would definitely harm the economy, and loss of potentially significant amount of defense funding. We have a lot of major defense contractors in Texas, which I think contribute a lot to the economy. Europe. I think most people assume at some point Greece will probably exit the Eurozone, but what's the ripple effect? Texas, I think the last figure I saw was about 10% of our exports are to the Eurozone. So what could be the impact there? China, significant trading partner for Texas. We saw a sharp decline in their gross domestic product this year, so that's a concern. And then, of course, the Middle East and what that could do to oil prices. So there's a lot of unknowns out there. There are some things we do know about the budget. We're going to face a significant supplemental spending demand. The biggest part of that is Medicaid. I think it's no secret that we did not fully fund the Medicaid program for this biennium, and we'll have to address that when we walk into session. There will be some other demands, but I would expect that's going to be the biggest piece of it. We'll have some basic spending demands that we face every session. Population growth, public education, Medicaid, transportation. Those will take up a significant piece of any revenue growth we see, possibly most of it. But despite all of this, I think there's still some opportunities next session in terms of making a significant investment in some infrastructure, water and transportation. Water, we have demands on both the supply side and also the infrastructure pipelines. Transportation, you ask anybody in South Texas about the Eagle Ford Shale, and they'll tell you that their roads are being torn up. Those county judges are crying out for help. But we also have a lot of demands with transportation overall, just in terms of keeping pace with construction versus just maintenance. Also, I think a big priority for the speaker is making the budget more transparent and accessible to the public. And part of that is a systemic issue, the use of these dedicated accounts to certify the budget, and some of the accounting gimmicks, deferring payments. We want to undo that, but also use some technology to make budget documents and the budget process more accessible to the public. So I'm going to be a lot shorter than John, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike, but I also look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, good morning, and I'd like to thank Dr. Murdoch and Billy Hamilton for the introduction, and to the Institute for doing this presentation. I think it's important. You know, I think a common thread throughout the comments that you've heard this morning might best be said this way. I think our state leadership now and for some time in the past has recognized that for John to be able to stand up here and tell you how our economy compares to other states and be able to do so and talk about the results proudly is not an accident. Maintaining a strong economy is a key goal of the leadership today. And so all the things that we talk about in terms of how to strike a balance, how to recognize the opportunities, how to suffer through some of the downtimes we've been through, I can assure you are all done with an eye towards maintaining a strong economy. Sometimes that's more challenging than others. Sometimes you get some more immediate and visible rewards than others. But all these steps are taken with an eye towards maintaining that strong economy. Now, John's given you some information about the revenue trending in a very positive direction. We all hope that continues for a long time. Andrew and others have talked about some of the challenges that may make that something that folks need to worry about. But since the topic here, at least, is partly focused on next session, let me say this. Some people would say it's easier to write a budget when there's not any new money than when there is new money. And there'll be new money this time. How much remains to be seen. But of course, when there's new money, back up. When there's not a lot of new money, it's relatively easy for the legislature to say, we've essentially established our allocations, this much for public ed, this much for higher ed, transportation, human services, and we just try to hold that line. when there's new money, it forces them to go into and gives them an opportunity, and I prefer to look at it as an opportunity. They may feel forced to do a rebalance and say, well, with this new money, how much of that should go to education, transportation, and et cetera, through all the functions of government. So I think that's what this session will be a lot about, is trying to, first, as Andrew said, recognize that there are some shortfalls that were left last session. You know, some people would say the legislature, when they came 2 years ago, faced a shortfall, a term that's not in law, by the way. So your definition of shortfall might be different than mine, might be different than one of theirs. But a shortfall reputed to be as high as $27 billion. The state has to have a balanced budget. That's constitutional. In fact, we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. To strike that balance last session, they left some holes. That results in stronger supplemental spending demands to finish out this biennium that Andrew talked about. So that's there. And I think what I'd like to talk to you about mostly is the principles that the governor's put out in the budget compact. And I'm going to list them for you, and then we'll go through and talk about each of them briefly, because I think they have an impact on how that allocation process works, how it starts, and maybe more importantly, how it finishes. So the budget compact is 5 principles. The first one is called truth in budgeting. And again, we'll come back and talk about each of these in a little more detail. The second one is a stronger spending limit. The third one is no new taxes or no increasing existing taxes. The fourth one, preserve a strong rainy day fund. And the last one is, and the legislature does this to a degree every time, the governor is going to emphasize at this time that we review all agency budget requests strictly. We review agency performance measures and outcomes with an eye towards eliminating unnecessary programs, with an eye towards freeing up money to put towards greater priorities. So with that, let's talk about the truth in budgeting a little more. Andrew mentioned deferrals. We deferred the payment to the foundation school program into the next biennium. That's a $2.1 billion item. We left unfunded the last several months of Medicaid, depending on how you forecast how 13 will come out. That is somewhere between a $4 and $5 billion item. I think the governor said in order to close a $27 billion shortfall, those were things that were not unreasonable steps. But in order to maintain a strong economy moving forward, those kinds of things shouldn't happen in a budget, and we're not going to do it again. So we're going to true up the holes that we've left, and we won't have any of those kind of holes left in the 14-15 budget coming out of next session. So true up probably happens in the supplemental spending bill, and then those mechanisms won't be used in writing the 14 and 15 budget. The stronger spending limit, well, before I do that, talk a little bit about the dedicated balance issue. Andrew mentioned it. This time, the legislature took advantage of the fact that there is $4.9 billion worth of funds that are dedicated for specific purposes that are not appropriated for those purposes. And it's purely legal to say, well, those $4.9 billion are sitting in the Treasury, and they could be used to help certify spending for something else if we needed to. So let's use that to certify the budget. And I think what you're going to see this time is an emphasis that says, because they were collected for a specific purpose, they ought to be either spent for that purpose, or we ought to stop collecting this money moving forward. And if there were a way to give back something if we're not going to appropriate it, maybe that should be looked at as well. But the point is, we're going to stop the practice, and it may take some, we didn't get here overnight. This is Billy mentioned the 86, 87 shortfall, and that started an era in state accounting, if you will, of people trying to think about creative ways to help maintain this base budget that we've got, that everybody agreed was important because it helped maintain the strong economy, position Texas to move forward even then. So they come up with ways like, well, here's these dedicated balances. We could keep them, but I don't know, Billy, what was it? $300 or $400 million issue back then, and now it's grown to almost $5 billion. So with the kind of strong economic performance we have now, it's time to say that needs to stop because it's been 20 years in the process. It may take a little while to unwind, but at least it's a priority, I think, of my boss and most of the legislature to say, It shouldn't probably have gotten to this level, and we're going to start undoing it. So, again, fund by fund, I would suggest to you, is probably the way to do that. That in round numbers, there's probably 200 of these dedicated accounts. They have different balances in them, everywhere from hundreds of millions to a few $1,000s. So, and each of them has its own story as to how that balance got there. You know, maybe the program that the fund was created to fund, the program has fallen into disuse, technology or other reasons. We don't really need to run the program anymore, but we still collect a fee for that purpose. We probably ought to stop that. Maybe a program and the cost of the program and the revenue that the fee generated don't quite match up, so that the fee generates more than the program really needs to run. Well, we probably ought to adjust that. So, but it's fund by fund, and that's what is going to make it a challenge for the legislature to go through and say, let's look at each of these and try to true it up, understanding we're going to stop the practice of purposefully having an ending balance in this fund to help certify other spending. The spending limit issue is this. The Constitution has actually 2 spending limits in it that are of general applicability. There's 2 others about debt and welfare spending, but for the overall state budget, there's 2 spending limits. Sometimes you hear one of them talked about as the pay-as-you-go limit. What that means is the legislature cannot spend more than the comptroller will certify in the upcoming biennium. There's another spending limit that says that the rate of growth in the state budget should not exceed the rate of growth in the state economy. That spending limit is currently calculated, or the state economy portion of that calculation is done on personal income. Except in periods of high inflation, personal income generally grows faster than population plus inflation, meaning that you have a spending limit that produces a limit so high that it's not functionally a limit. So the governor is talking with members, talking with the public about a constitutional amendment that would strengthen that back to something that we believe is a truer match with the state economy, and that is population and inflation. No new taxes, no increasing taxes, I think speaks for itself. Preserve a strong rainy day fund says this. As John talked about, you know, the rainy day fund has 3 sources of revenue. Could have a 4th. The 4th could be that the legislature at any time could take money from any other fund and put it in the rainy day fund. Pretty rare, so let's not worry about that one. Otherwise, the sources of revenue into the rainy day fund are some portion of a GR ending balance, should we have one. But of course, if you appropriate all the money every time, you don't have much of a GR ending balance, usually. And then oil and gas revenues above a certain threshold. John told you exactly how dynamic those industries are performing today. So, you know, they're going to be the bulk of the transfer into the rainy day fund. At $8 billion, the rainy day fund is considerably above 5% of the state budget. Some people have said, bond rating agencies have told me verbally, told others. Interesting, bond rating agencies don't ever give you a written checklist of how I'm going to rate you. You know, if they would give you a written set of standards and say, this is how your rating is done, then you would do the best you could to meet those standards. But instead, you get, you know, anecdotal tidbits about this is important to us, that's important to us. And in those kind of conversations, the 5% numbers come out. Well, $8 billion, considerably above 5%. So I think a discussion about using some of the rainy day fund, whether it's for infrastructure projects or some people would say maybe some of that money ought to go try to help fill some of this supplemental need that Andrew talked about. There's some decisions to be made there, but I think some of the rainy day fund will be used next time. But the principle for the governor is preserve a strong rainy day fund. So it doesn't mean don't spend any of it. It also doesn't mean, well, it also does mean, but we're not going to spend all of it. We're going to keep a strong enough rainy day fund to help smooth out these curves that the presentations that you've heard this morning have talked about. And my time in state government has been nothing but that. The state economy doesn't ever run on a cycle like that, and thank God it doesn't run on that or even flat. But in the aggregate, that stream increases, as it should, with population growth, with inflation, with a growing demand for services. The growth is fine, but it's never linear. So keeping a strong rainy day fund to help fill in some of the dips is important. And I think the 5th one really speaks for itself too, that every session the appropriations process looks at starts with agencies submitting a budget request, individual members, committees, the governor's office, and others look at those requests, look at agencies' performance, and try to decide, is this agency doing what it's supposed to be doing? Is it doing what we ask it to do? How well is it doing that? Could it do better, and if so, how? Do we need to adjust what it's doing and maybe from time to time look and say, is it still doing, maybe it's doing what we ask it to do, and that ask was 10 years ago. Do we still need it to do that? It may be doing it very well, but do we still need that done? So with all the challenges that you heard when we started, school finance lawsuits, Medicaid growing largely because of population and largely because healthcare costs exceed the rate of general growth in the economy by a factor of somewhere between 2 and 3-fold. Is money being appropriated in some place now better put to use someplace else? And that's the focus of that review. So with that, I'll finish as well, Billy, and turn it back to you.
Naturally enough, the exact minute I need him to tell me how long we have for questions, Steve walks out. So while we wait for him to come back, I ask if there's anyone that wants to ask any of the panel members a question, and kind of, if you do, speak up. Otherwise, I'll ask a couple that occurred to me. Anybody? Well, the first question, maybe I asked Andrew and Mike. The way I interpreted last session, maybe correctly, maybe not so correctly, is that basically the legislature chose, and the governor chose, the legislature chose to rebase spending. And one reason things will look a lot better now is if we stick to that reduced base. And partly that's not even possible because part of the rebasing was not funding Medicaid for the full 24 months, and part of it was reducing school spending to sort of what we spent in the past, but not allowing for population growth. Now we've got another 2 years of population growth. I mean, will the legislature be working from the reduced base? Will they be thinking about restoring some of the school cuts ahead of any lawsuits that might or might not come out? And
yeah, I think easy question to start with. I think that's correct. We did sort of reset the level of spending, and that'll be our starting point. Setting aside school finance, which is going to be the outcome of those lawsuits, and as you mentioned, probably won't know the outcome of that until after session. Medicaid, we need to pay that final amount, but if you want to talk about growth from population and cost growth from inflation, it's going to be starting from the new floor across the board for all of state government. I'm sure there's going to be a push by some members to restore some of those budget cuts, and we'll have that discussion next session. But I'll tell you, the bill that you'll see filed in January is the starting point is where we left it last session.
Yeah, I think I just echo that. I think that's the right place to start. So yes, there's some adjustments that need to be made to that base, and you emphasized, I think, the two largest ones, maybe both most important substantively and largest in terms of dollar amounts. So maybe there's some adjustments to that base at the start. Certainly there'll be some adjustments to it throughout the process, but that's where you start.
Anybody? Yes, sir.
Mr. Hamilton asked a question that addresses my interest about education. I think we cut education only because, not because it needed cutting, but because of the revenue shortage. Now we don't have that shortage. Why don't we directly refund what we took away, especially an obvious piece of interest, and we talked about principle of that principle of 22 to 1 in the lower grades, for example. Why can't we go back there right away and replace that, or will we have revenue to do that in your judgment?
You want to start?
Sure. There were more elements to what was done with school finance last session, just short of fitting within a certain revenue number. I mean, there was some components of it, I think, that districts wanted a little more flexibility and control. But overall, I think you're going to have that conversation when we see the outcome of the lawsuits about, do we maintain the current system? Do we change the formulas? Do we put more money in? I don't expect that to be addressed, though, until we know the outcome of the lawsuits.
You know, that's where I kind of use that word principle, because we're saying we'll do it if we're forced to by the courts. And I think we lowered the money because we didn't have enough money, not because there was something wrong with the schools. We just thought we didn't have enough money to pay for it. Now we have enough. I would challenge the governor to, in a principled way, answer this before those lawsuits. It was unfortunate we had to bring that rate down and raise class size all over the state, but why don't we reverse it now based on principle?
Well, I think the other thing to add is we don't know how much money we'll have until John puts out his estimate in January. And it has to fit into the larger
Unless he wants
budget.
to reveal it now.
Exactly.
No pressure, John, would you? I think I'd say it this way, that at the time I've worked in the state legislature, be it the 16 years with various entities in the legislative arm, or the 11 years I've been with the governor, I've never seen public education be anything other than this process's highest priority. So Andrew said we'll have that conversation. I have no doubt that we'll have the conversation. I do think there are two factors that play into when that conversation can be completed. I expect it to be started very soon. I'm sure that in some levels it is happening now as the LBB works towards crafting a bill for introduction, as the governor's office works on its budget. That conversation, it would be fairest to say that conversation is started already. Now there are two factors come into play. One, Billy has just mentioned. I hope that we didn't leave anybody with the impression this morning that the revenue picture is going to be so great that we can meet everybody's request in human services, everybody's request for infrastructure, be it transportation or water, everybody's request in public and higher education, because I've never seen that happen. And while I think we are in a really good time in terms of recovery and proud of where we are relative to other states, I'm going to be very surprised if a revenue estimate is released by the controller in January that allows the legislature to say, hey, we can go through and do all this rebasing, and we can fund everything in all of these major areas of state government's request above that. And once you can't do that, then it starts the conversation. That was the point I think I tried to make with the conversation about sometimes more money is a different set of challenges and maybe more challenging than when you don't have any money. That prioritization happens not just in the area of public education, but it has to happen through a process that says, let's let the members hear about the needs in human services. Let's let the members hear about the needs in infrastructure as our population continues to grow and our infrastructure continues to age. Those are very real needs as well. And so that question may somewhat best be answered only after all of those conversations can be had, not just one about education. Understanding that it's a priority, and it will be a priority throughout those conversations, it's still a balance on how to divide, how to allocate what new money you have. The second piece, quite frankly, is this. There are people who would say, with 6 lawsuits out there, I'm not sure the goal ought to be, let's try to go back and fund the system that we have or have funded in the past for fear that doing that is, I mean, that's the system that's being challenged right now. If you allocate new money to that system and the court says, no, do something else, well, now the money that you could have put towards something else, you've put in an old system. And there are a lot of people in various places across the state who, I think, yes, they now want to see what the court says, and it may, without anybody's intent being this, that it has not a chilling effect, maybe but a dilatory effect on, if you start with the premise that everybody wants to fund public ed so that you have a public education system that everybody here is proud of, that gives us the advantage to maintain that strong economy, start there. Then how do we do that? And if I'm at some risk that the courts are about to tell me something that I've never heard before, I think there are people for whom that will have a dilatory effect.
John's figure was that 60% of the state's revenue comes from retail sales tax. Can anyone on the panel speak to internet taxes, retail sales, expectations, anything?
Do you have anything a little bit more specific, perhaps?
What's the current state of play with respect to internet taxation?
Okay. With respect to internet taxation, it is as it has been, and it's a legal situation. And the situation is that if you being the internet company, have a physical presence in our state, then you're going to be required to collect tax from your customers that are purchasing on your website. If you do not, then you don't have that duty. And it continues as it has been. Recently, a very large company, Amazon, who does have a physical presence in our state, began collecting tax from its customers on its website. We have any number of internet companies that do have a warehouse, they have employees, they have some sort of presence in our state, and they collect taxes as well. There are a lot that don't. And so I think probably the situation is going to continue to work itself out, but in the world of internet, I think probably you're always going to have a situation where, due to the innate nature of the internet business, you may never have a physical presence in our state. So if this law is not changed by our federal Congress, or something else substantial happens such that they will have a duty, then I think we're always going to have some level of firms that don't collect our sales tax.
Yes.
Someone on the panel, maybe Mike, you could speak to the economic development incentives that the government may or may not extend for next session. There's been some talk that there's a bit of political pressure to eliminate the economic development incentives, which he holds so dear. It would be great if we could obviously sustain things like 313 and TDF, ETF, but what are you hearing as far as the governor's wishes to keep those programs?
Well, I guess I'll start back with the principle of strong economy, and we believe that the economic development incentives, as a package that we have developed over the last decade, are absolutely responsible for, in part, Texas being in the position that it's in. Now, last session, the legislature wanted to look at and review some of those piece by piece, and I think what they found was this piece-by-piece review is maybe not the best way to do this, and maybe we ought to have a more holistic review of what the incentives, what an economic development plan ought to look like moving forward. So that effort's underway now. I think it'll be concluded, at least with some recommendations, roughly at the start of the session, so that the legislature has that information to work with throughout the session. I think the 313, you mentioned three in particular, the 313, the Enterprise Fund, and the Emerging Tech Fund are all things that, if you look in the governor's budget request, for example, this time there is continued funding for the Enterprise and Emerging Technology Fund. I think 313 is something that we support, although, you know, I'm happy to have a conversation about, you know, in its application, has it been allowed to apply in some places too broadly, or are there adjustments you could make to it so that, you know, in various segments, I mean, the principal argument with 313 is that depending on what industry you apply it to, in some industries it produces a very good return on a per job basis, and on others it doesn't. And so, you know, how you calculate that, or should there possibly be a cap per job on the amount of credit that can be given. But we've worked with the legislature to put together a panel to try to review all of these, so that more holistic approach, and they're working on those recommendations. So, you know, it's important. I don't think there's a move afoot that has any momentum behind it to say that we're drastically going to diminish what we do in this field. In fact, I hope it might go the other way. But the exact details of what that effort looks like after the review, we'll see when we get the report. But it will continue to be an area of priority for us.
Yes.
Could you just generally, each of you, talk about the Medicaid expansion and what impact it would have on Texas?
Well, I've let everybody else start other questions, so I guess I'll do this one. I think the issue with Medicaid expansion is this, that the current program is, you know, we talked about a $4 to $5 billion shortfall for this biennium. The current program is unsustainable on its current trajectory unless the federal government will give states some more flexibility to try to work within a reasonable portion of the budget. Otherwise, the portion of the budget that Medicaid consumes now has a nickname, crowd out, that it's crowding out the expenditures on public education, on higher education, on other things. And so if the current program is unsustainable without some changes in the rules, which would have to happen at the federal level, adding another considerable portion of the population to an unsustainable program only races it to its end sooner. And so therein lies the reason the governor does not support Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Mike said. Program as it's structured now is unsustainable, and even while the federal government would pick up those costs in the near future, it's the out years, I think, that concern us, that we're just exacerbating the problem of making an unsustainable program that much more unsustainable. So the speaker agrees. Ideally, we'd like to see state have a lot more flexibility in administering the program, and given that option, yeah, covering as many eligible people as possible, but not the way it's structured now.
If I may, one more. Ambassador Durigian talked about even vouchers, and Mr. Morsi mentioned the conversation. I was going to say, Mr. Strauss's office, you know the thinking of the majority. What do you see as the possibility of vouchers being proposed and passing?
I think we're going to definitely have that conversation. We've been having that discussion with members and getting their thoughts. I think if you are talking about a pure voucher program with no sorts of accountability or strings attached, that's a difficult sell for a lot of members. But giving parents more flexibility within the public education system gets a lot more support. I think, you know, it all comes down to the details and exactly what the proposal entails. But I think there's a sentiment out there that we need to give parents more choices and increase a little bit of competition to increase quality in public education. It's just how you go about getting there.
One question, I actually had two questions, and maybe these will be to close unless somebody else thinks of something.
You did have one more up there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just had a question. We touched on it.
Can't see him.
But and this may be for you, Andrew. Is there going to be movement this year on the state's water plan? I mean, I know they've been meeting over the summer a little bit on it, but there doesn't seem to be much happening yet.
I think there's a growing sentiment among the members, and definitely the speaker, that obviously we can't address the number that's been floating around out there, $50 billion plus, but we need to start doing something about it, making some sort of investment, be that some sort of revolving fund that gives local governments access to some capital, or just making some straightforward strategic investments. I think the realization is set in that the problem isn't going away, it's not getting any better, and it's not going to get any cheaper the longer you wait. So I think there's going to be a strong push this session to at least start the process, and it's going to take many years to address those needs, but I think you'll see that started this session.
Okay, the one thing I'm interested in, John and I actually talked about this before, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider, especially going into the session, is last month sales tax collections in a lot of the major cities, except Dallas for reasons I don't fully understand, were up in the very high double-digit level. Austin was 21%. I think Houston was like 19%. And it seemed to be pretty widespread over the state, and it can't all be related to oil and natural gas, which is how I was explaining it earlier. But have you looked at that data? And our people in Austin thought it was the Amazon deal, but apparently it wasn't that either.
No, I don't think it was that. This is interesting, Billy, and we've talked about this before. Just like some of the employment issues we talked about, this is not some sort of monolith. All the different sales taxes that various jurisdictions have around the state, there are important industries in each one of those towns and communities that add to that, and they all act a little bit differently. And it just so happened that again, and I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but as we recover from recession, and there are a lot of things that were delayed or put off that are now being purchased. As all these things are occurring, they're kind of all occurring now. So whether you're in any of these various parts of our state, and we see these tax collections up rather strongly, it's probably for a different reason. For example, in downtown Dallas, Billy, you're right, it's not going to be oil and gas. It's something else going on there. In many cases, our data we have simply isn't detailed enough or textured enough to tell us the answer to that. But most certainly, it's not going to be. And then if you're in Midland, for example, well, it probably is oil and gas. In many cases, it can be said that the consumer who was affected just as greatly as a lot of these other industries in the recession, they have returned to the stores. So we are seeing retail sales quite a bit better. We are seeing in the last year things such as sales at appliance stores, much better. Sales at home improvement stores, much better. So again, these are people that put off purchases, delayed doing things for the last several years. They're now getting that new refrigerator. They're now replacing that television set. They're now replacing that carpeting in the guest room. And it's all happening now. Now, does that actually answer your question, Billy? I don't think it actually does, but there's a lot of things being purchased now for these reasons, and they're all happening at essentially the same time, but they are going to be different according to what city it is.
Well, I would point out that the National Retail Federation says this is going to be the biggest Halloween in American history. So people will spend I just read this yesterday, people will spend $370 million nationwide on pet costumes, and 7 out of 10 adults will celebrate, and 45% of them will wear costumes, which I think is probably the scariest statistic I've read.
No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended. Well, I want to just leave with one thing, and I was going to ask this as a question, but I think I've asked enough annoying questions of our panel. I do some work now, since I'm out of the big government, for a little government, which is a Metropolitan Transit Authority. And we were fortunate enough to get a senator mad at us, who will remain unnamed, and he put this agency under sunset review, which is the statewide review of state agencies, but every now and then they get to do a review of a local agency that's gotten in the doghouse. And one of the things that they recommended and then wrote into the law, helpfully, was to require this agency to do a long-range financial plan. And, you know, one of the things that has struck me over time, and I leave you with this thought, and I think I call this the Steve Murdoch Memorial thought, is that we probably don't do enough long-term planning at the state level. We budget on 2-year cycles, kick the can, you know, we deal with that session. And in a 140-day session, that makes a lot of practical sense, because it's everything the members can do to deal with all the various issues they see, plus the budget. But I think at some point, the state needs to ask itself the question with water and public education and the long-term implications of health care in an aging population and an increasingly diverse population and a growing population, all these things that Steve talks about in his speeches, whether we shouldn't be, as painful as it may be and as difficult as it may be, if we shouldn't be trying to do a 5-year or a 10-year forecast, and John will hate this, I know, of revenues and expenditures, because, you know, I have to say, when my little Metropolitan Transit Authority did this 5-year, 10-year forecast, it was an enlightening exercise, and we found things that we were not expecting, and we didn't have all the answers on day one, but we were able to look forward. And the state is a remarkably strong place, but I think, as the panelists have so ably pointed out, there's a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. And, you know, what we talk about too often is constraining policy choices to prevent the legislature from doing what needs to be done to meet those needs. And I think part of it is just because we can't agree on what those needs really are and how they interact. And perhaps someday we should, someday, I don't suspect I will still be alive when it happens, but perhaps someday we'll do that. I wish you'd thank the panelists. They are the most knowledgeable people in the state. And I think that's our panel.
We've got a 15-minute break, but we're going to start promptly at 10:45.